Новус, люди ходят. Новус, люди ходят. Новус, люди ходят. Новус, люди ходят. Новус, люди ходят.
If this, even if Russia takes Kiev, it faces the risk of fighting a guerrilla war in many cities, in Kiev, in Kharkiv, in Dnipro, in Melitopol, in Mariupol, in Mykolaiv. The list goes on of places they've already attacked. So while the Russian military has a lot more capability than the Ukrainians, and certainly has the ability likely to seize these cities in the coming days, it doesn't have the ability to pacify them.
So where does Ukraine go from here? What happens next?
Well, that's a tragedy. It appears likely Ukraine will either be split in two or be forced to fight in a brutal guerrilla war that will undermine the strength of any future Ukraine and risks putting it in a situation like Syria or Yemen has been. However, I think that this sounds as if I'm speaking about a unilateral success for Vladimir Putin, and I would not say that. This is an unprovoked war of aggression, the third time that Putin has started a war of aggression in the last 15 years, and I think the international community is beginning to wake up, and we've seen that with sanctions, even from non-traditional U.S. partners on such issues like Singapore, joining in and condemning Russia, and Putin is in some ways laying the risks for his own potential fall from power by committing fratricide amongst the Slavic peoples of Russia and Ukraine, and is really beginning to undermine his own regime at home as well.
Maximilian, analysts argue that this invasion is a massive wake-up call for Europe. What do you make of that statement? And could this get any worse?
Well, I think it's a massive wake-up call for Western Europe, in particular Germany, the United Kingdom, places that have been all too willing to do business with Russia and the Russian state, despite its previous wars of aggression. Eastern Europe has been sounding the alarm for well over a decade now, and even before Russia's first invasion of Georgia. I think it does need to be a wake-up call not only for Western Europe, but also for the rest of the world, including countries like India that have good relations with Russia and the United States. But now it is very clear that Putin is an aggressor, somebody who starts wars for no reason other than his own desires. And I think that will be a wake-up call for the rest of the world. I certainly hope it will be.
Finally, we have moved from dialogue, diplomacy to joint and concerted actions by Western leaders, and to top the cream, stringent economic sanctions. Will this deter the Kremlin?
I don't think stringent economic sanctions right now are likely to deter the Kremlin. We've seen some of the most drastic measures announced in over 80 years against a major country, but the sanctions regime now essentially is very close to the sanctions regime on Iran. Of course, with an even larger number of states supporting it, because it was the United States that unilaterally reimposed those and reneged on its agreements with Iran under 2014. But the United States had made very clear, and so had the European Union, and to a lesser extent the United Kingdom, that these kind of sanctions were what would happen if Putin invaded.
Новус, люди ходят.
invaded Ukraine. It is Putin who has chosen to cut the Russian economy and the Russian people off from the financial world and the technological around the world. And it is Vladimir Putin who will bear responsibility for that over the long term. So I don't think it will deter him. He's made this choice knowingly, but I do think it will in the long term significantly affect the relationship between the Russian people who do not want war and who I believe are against this war, and the dictator who does want it and has forced it upon them.
Maximilian, what are the general ramifications of this conflict to the world?
The general ramifications of this conflict to the world are incredibly wide-reaching. I think, firstly, it really shows that the threat of a new world war that we had so long assumed was gone, perhaps in some countries as a result of nuclear weapons, that is not the case. It has shown that there are still countries that believe they can unilaterally change borders by force. Putin has now done that twice in Ukraine and once in Georgia and threatened to do so elsewhere. For the whole world, this has an impact. For example, for India and its relations with China, if China moves to support Putin on this, as it has given some indications it will, although I think he'll be upset at the lack of support thus far, that raises the potential for China to look to unilaterally change its borders with India, as it has threatened to do in the past as well. So I think it behooves the entire world, in particular democratic countries and countries that believe in the rule of law and believe in the inviolability of sovereign borders, to announce this and to oppose it in whatever way that they can.
Maximilian Haas, thank you very much for your insights and for talking to us on We On today. And now some news from the world of art and culture and music. Artists are using their creative mediums to speak against the ongoing Russia-Ukraine conflict. They all want the same thing: for the war to end and peace to prevail. We'll have that report a little later in this broadcast.
Люди ходят.
While Oscar-winning Spanish actor Javier Bardem joined a protest outside the Russian embassy in Madrid to support the Ukrainian people, the 52-year-old said he feared that Russia's invasion would trigger a huge refugee crisis. Putin's military operation into the Ukrainian land, sea and air is the biggest attack by one state against another in Europe since the Second World War. Bardem further believes that this seizure violates Ukraine's fundamental right to territorial sovereignty and international law. Oscar-nominated producer Monica Hellstrom and director Simon Wilmont recently evacuated orphaned Ukrainian refugees to safer zones following Russia's military operation inside Ukraine. The Danish duo's new documentary, A House Made of Splinters, will be based on their recent attempt. Wilmont's recent work followed the tale of 3 orphans who were sheltered in Ukraine's Luhansk before being further moved away from potential bombardments. Hellstrom received nomination for 2 Academy Awards this year for her animated documentary Flee, which is based on an orphaned Afghan refugee.
I think it's very important to talk about it.
Chicago Symphony
Люди ходят. Люди ходят. Люди ходят.
Orchestra music director Riccardo Muti took the rest
Люди ходят. Новус. Люди ходят. Новус. Люди ходят.
Step to address the audience before a performance of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony at the city's Orchestra Hall. Talking about the Russia-Ukraine conflict, the Italian composer said a message should arrive to all the people not only in Ukraine but in the world who are creating violence, hate and a strange need for war. We are against all that. My name is Eric Njoka. That's the latest at this hour. You are watching We On World is One. Stay with us.
Новус. Люди
From the black.
अरे गया नहीं अभी तक? गाड़ी की सर्विस कब से ड्यू है यार? ये थोड़ी जाएंगे कहीं, ये तो गाड़ी की सर्विस करवाने के लिए कहीं जाने की जरूरत नहीं है। चिल, कोई गड़बड़ नहीं है। गो मैकेनिक पर पाए एक्सपर्ट कार सर्विसेज, 50 पॉइंट इंस्पेक्शन और 3 महीने की अनकंडीशनल वारंटी। डाउनलोड करें इंडिया का नंबर 1 कार सर्विसेज ऐप गो मैकेनिक।
Go mechanic.
अरे गया नहीं अभी तक? गाड़ी की सर्विस कब से ड्यू है यार? ये थोड़ी जाएंगे कहीं, ये तो गाड़ी की सर्विस करवाने के लिए कहीं जाने की जरूरत नहीं है। चिल, कोई गड़बड़ नहीं है। गो मैकेनिक पर पाए एक्सपर्ट कार सर्विसेज, 50 पॉइंट इंस्पेक्शन और 3 महीने की अनकंडीशनल वारंटी। डाउनलोड करें इंडिया का नंबर 1 कार सर्विसेज ऐप गो मैकेनिक।
Go mechanic.
Joe Biden, now the 46th president of the United
Люди ходят. Новус. 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 Люди ходят.
United States has a full plate in front of him.
Afghanistan has been the heart of American military power.
In a clear warning to China, India's military has now taken control of the country for 1 year.
What was happening inside the virology lab in Wuhan?
One ship was able to freeze global trade.
We want love, we want peace, we want equality!
There are
a traditional recipe, and it's really very delicious.
It's code red for humanity.
The alarm bells are deafening. Wildfires, floods, and hurricanes. Extreme climate events warn of impending doom. Is the world heading towards a climate catastrophe? Watch WION's Climate Tracker, weekdays at 12 p.m. GMT, 5:30 p.m. IST.
You don't know how to fix the holes in our ozone layer. You don't know how to bring the salmon back up a dead stream. You don't know how to bring back an animal now extinct. And you can't bring back the forest that once grew where there is now a desert.
You have ignored us in the past and you will ignore us again. We have run out of excuses and we are running out of time.
Show us your faithfulness. Show us your trustworthiness. Show us your honesty. Prove us wrong. We desperately need you to prove us wrong. God help us all if you fail. To prove us wrong. God help us.
One trillion species. 7.8 billion humans. 1.9 million species. One planet.
Thank you very much for staying with us and welcome back. We are glad you're watching WION World is One. The coverage on the Ukraine crisis continues. My name is Eric Njoka. Let's begin with the global headlines. The United Nations says more than 100,000 Ukrainians have fled to neighboring countries, mainly Poland, Hungary, Moldova, Slovakia, and Romania. Polish Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki slams Western countries such as Germany for displaying what he calls unyielding egoism in the face of Russia's war in Ukraine, saying crushing sanctions are needed. Russia says it is closing its airspace to flights from Bulgaria, Poland, and the Czech Republic in response to punishment over Moscow's invasion of Ukraine. The official website of Russian President Vladimir Putin, Kremlin.ru, is down following reports of cyber attacks on various other Russian government and state media websites. Crowds of protesters took to the streets in Rome calling for peace in Ukraine, waving flags and banners demanding Russia to stop the invasion of its neighbor. And in another major hit to Russian sports, Poland says they will not play Russia in the FIFA World Cup qualifying playoff scheduled for next month.
Видели?
Russia's invasion into Ukraine has divided the world. The United States and its allies in the West have tried to project a united front against Russian aggression, but Russia too has mustered its allies. So let's take a look at who has backed the war and who has condemned it in unequivocal terms and who has remained neutral during Europe's worst crisis since the World War II. Let's start with the US. Sponsored draft resolution at the UNSC. The draft sought to deplore in the strongest terms Russia's aggression against Ukraine. The draft resolution was bound to fail. Russia, as a permanent member, vetoed the draft. China, India and the United Arab Emirates abstained from voting, while 11 nations, including the 3 permanent members like the US, UK and France, and 8 non-permanent members, including Albania, Brazil, Gabon, Ghana, Ireland, Kenya, Mexico and Norway, voted in favor. Far from being isolated from the international community. Despite the sweeping sanctions, Vladimir Putin has managed to cement his ties with China. In his visit to Beijing in the first week of February, Moscow and Beijing entered into a deep strategic partnership with no limits, and where the two allies agreed that there are no forbidden areas of cooperation. Russia, through its strategic intervention in the Syrian civil war,
люди ходят. Люди ходят.
Has earned an ally in Bashar al-Assad. Since 2011, the United States pursued a policy of regime change in Syria by backing the rebels fighting against government to oust Bashar al-Assad from Damascus. But Putin, through military aid from 2011 and direct military involvement in Syria from 2015, helped Assad turn the tide of the Syrian civil war. Russia has its only Mediterranean port in Syria at Tartus. It also exercises close control over the Syrian port of Latakia. This has turned Syria into a stout Russian ally in the region. Syria is the only other country after Russia to have recognized Donetsk and Luhansk as independent republics. Russian Deputy Prime Minister Yuri Borisov was on a whirlwind tour of the leftist nations in the Western Hemisphere from the 16th of February. He met the leaders of Venezuela, Cuba and Nicaragua and signed a series of strategic cooperation agreements on aspects such as trade, energy and financial cooperation. Russia's decisive intervention into Kazakhstan has reiterated Russia's position of preeminence in Central Asia. In the month of January, Kazakhstan erupted into a nationwide unrest, sparked by a spike in fuel prices. But Russia, leading the CSTO troops, managed to crush the protests in a short and decisive operation. Most Central Asian countries or nations have maintained friendly relations with Moscow and have not condemned Russia's invasion into Ukraine. So although the United States has been marking its diplomatic levers to isolate Russia for invading Ukraine, Vladimir Putin so far in the conflict has successfully managed to call the Americans bluff and has also shored up support for the Russian nation. Well, for more on that, we earlier spoke to Editor-in-Chief of BNE Intel News, Ben Aries from Berlin.
If Russia's launched a shock and awe campaign, its military vastly outguns the Ukrainian one. However, it's limited itself so far to rocket attacks on strategic assets, military infrastructure. The power station in Kiev was hit last night, and it's escalated this morning. Residential buildings are being targeted. Happily, they're mostly empty. Although the civilian casualty has gone up to just under 200 people. But given the scale of this countrywide invasion, 200 is actually still quite a small number. And Europe has been shocked, absolutely shocked. Nobody was expecting Putin to go all the way and go across the border, but he's done it. And now they're scrambling to catch up. However, they put contingency plans in, sanction plans. The legislation, the coordination between the Western partners has been ongoing since this started in October, November. And now all those things are being rolled out. The sanctions, significant sanctions, have been rolled out. Specifically, the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline has been suspended, killed, the approval process, which was going to be one of the last sanctions, and it actually has been one of the first. And that's a serious blow. And as for the sanctions' effectiveness, unfortunately, Putin has prepared Russia with huge reserves, with low debts, and they're not going to have much effect. They won't hurt the Russian economy. They won't change Putin's mind, nor make him stop this. So we have little leverage over him.
India's External Affairs Ministry is working round the clock to assure the safe return of Indian nationals stuck in Ukraine. In the latest update, more batches of Indian students have arrived in Hungary from the Zahony crossing and will be travelling to Budapest, from where they will return on the special Air India evacuation flight. Meanwhile, Indians that crossed the border into Romania have left for Mumbai via a special evacuation flight. The flight is expected to land at around 9 p.m. local time. This is the first flight from Romania to India after the Russia-Ukraine crisis escalated into a fully blown invasion.
I know that you have come through a very long and arduous road journey. So the last thing in your mind is an announcement by the ambassador. But before you left, I thought I'd just say hello to you.
In its latest advisory, New Delhi has urged all nationals to not move to any of the border posts without prior coordination with Indian officials. The latest statement says that situation at many checkpoints is extremely sensitive. The Indian government is working closely with Poland, Slovakia and Romania to ensure safe return of its citizens. But according to officials, it is becoming increasingly difficult to help nationals cross over to other nations. Everyone has been advised to stay calm and use their limited supplies of food, water and medicines wisely. Vaccine certificate or a negative COVID report is mandatory to enter India, but the government has decided to exempt those fleeing from Ukraine. The decision has been taken on humanitarian grounds. Well, for more on this, we earlier spoke to Harsh V. Pant, who is a distinguished fellow and head of Observer Research Foundation's Strategic Studies program from New Delhi.
At a number of levels. One, of course, is if the hostilities continue to rise, the evacuation of Indian citizens becomes even more difficult. So while at the moment evacuation is happening gradually but surely, I think if hostilities continue to rise and if the bloodshed and destruction continues, then I think it would be very difficult to save a lot of our citizens from the trauma that they are going through at the moment. The other important aspect is global economy. Global economy, which was which had been coming out of recession, COVID-19, just beginning to see some blooming of global economic scenario. We are now back to square one with high prices of fuel, with high prices of energy, with high prices of food. So I think the challenge now is how do you make sure that this conflict remains confined, that the de-escalation happens rapidly, and that countries go back to doing what they are supposed to do, that is building back their economies, which with one stroke Russia has ensured that we have gone back years. So I think there are these priorities, plus the priority for India being that that global order that is changing so rapidly, where global contestation has been rising in any case. With this conflict, I think Russia has ensured that between West and Russia and China, the contestation is even going to be stronger, and that would make India's life, like many other countries' life, more difficult.
Well, amid the ongoing Ukraine-Russia crisis, the ambassador of Poland to India spoke to our principal diplomatic correspondent, Siddhant Sibal. He spoke about a host of issues, from supporting the evacuation of Indian nationals from Ukraine to European Union's response to the ongoing crisis. Watch.
This a moment in time is going to change the destiny of Europe and, of course, the world. How big is this invasion in terms of the European capitals, how they look at this invasion by the Russians of Ukraine?
This is not the first aggressive act committed by Russia. In 2008, Russia invaded Georgia. In 2014, Russia invaded Ukraine, as you remember. And now it's another invasion of Russia, but this time it's on much bigger scale. This is a full-scale military campaign aimed at crushing Ukraine, at killing civilians, killing women and children, elder people. So we are really strengthening our security. We are members of NATO, of the European Union, and these organizations, they help Ukraine, not only militarily. Many NATO countries send military weapons and other resources to Ukraine. Also, European Union is helping Ukraine with loans, with humanitarian assistance.
Ukraine is under attack and Russian troops are undeterred. Ukraine citizens have been asked to help fight the enemy. Men aged between 18 and 60 were asked to stay back. Families packed whatever they could carry on their backs to seek shelter across the borders, mainly in Romania, Poland and Moldova. Here's a look at what this perilous journey entails.
These are the residents of Ukraine, leaving their homes as Russian troops move deeper into the country. With little on their backs on a perilous journey, trying to cross over to Poland in search of shelter and security. This miles-long queue is made up of scared individuals, anxious mothers, children who are too young to understand what is happening, hoping to escape missile strikes, bombing, hoping to never have to wake up to air raid sirens, and to never bear witness to the panic and commotion sparked off by Russian military operations. It's a long wait, 6 to 12 hours. But what other options do they have?
Because of martial law, all military obliged, all men must fight for the country, for peace, to prevent attacks from enemy forces, and for everything to be all right. We and children must leave Ukraine.
In just 48 hours, some 50,000 residents fled the country. The UN Refugee Agency has requested neighboring countries to keep their borders open. Around 5 million are at the risk of being displaced. Across the border, Polish residents rushed to assist Ukrainians. Moldova, on the other hand, set up special humanitarian centers with medical staff and social workers, all set to assist displaced Ukrainians and provide basic humanitarian, legal and food aid. And then we have Romania, that witnessed an influx from 6 different checkpoints. As per the border police, the inflow is up by 120%. While some plan to huddle till they have more clarity, others plan to continue their journey to other European nations. These border crossings have witnessed several tough goodbyes over the last few days, and that is a gross understatement. With many forced to leave behind their husbands, fathers and brothers.
Where are you going? Where will you go?
Do you have a place to sleep?
Poland.
Your husband, where is he?
Ukraine.
He managed to live or not?
People across the world have come together to denounce the Russian invasion in Ukraine and to express solidarity with the citizens of Ukraine. Thousands from more than 50 countries came out on the streets demanding peace in Ukraine and stricter sanctions against Russia. Take a look.
Quanti presenti? Putin! Giù le mani da Ucraina!
Єласкавої розрадниці.
Uma Ave Maria em ucraniano. E depois essa paz esperada.
Os pecadores adorem na hora de nossa morte.
What they need to do, they do Ukraine will fight. Ukraine. Reaching out to every single friend that I still have left. Stop Putin now. Stop Putin now.
The Russian invasion of Ukraine continues to have far-reaching consequences for Russians in the sporting world. Chelsea manager Thomas Tuchel has admitted that there is uncertainty surrounding the future of the club's Russian owner Roman Abramovich. Billionaire and oligarch Abramovich has put huge sums into Chelsea since buying the club in 2003, which has paved the way for the club to become one of Europe's powerhouses. Labour Member of Parliament Chris Bryant said earlier this week that all of Abramovich's assets in the UK should be seized following Russia's invasion of Ukraine and suggested he should even be barred from owning the club. Abramovich is believed to be extremely close to Russian President Vladimir Putin, although he has strongly denied those claims. Ahead of the EFL Cup final against Liverpool on Sunday, Tuchel said that his mind was clouded after the outbreak of war and added that he could not pretend that it was not an issue within the club. The future of Russian Formula One driver Nikita Mazepin at the Haas team is also in doubt. US-based Haas removed its sponsorship from Russian company Ural Kali, which funds Mazepin's position at the team. The founder of that company is Nikita's father, Dmitry Mazepin, who was one of the business leaders who met Russian President Putin to discuss the sanctions placed on the country. A final decision is expected soon. This coverage continues. You are watching We On Wild is One. My name is Eric Njoka. Thank you very much for watching, and goodbye for now.
गया नहीं अभी तक? गाड़ी की सर्विस कब से ड्यू है यार? ये थोड़ी जाएंगे कहीं। ये तो गाड़ी की सर्विस करवाने के लिए कहीं जाने की जरूरत नहीं है। कोई गड़बड़ नहीं है। गो मैकेनिक पर पाए एक्सपर्ट कार सर्विसेज, 50 पॉइंट इंस्पेक्शन और 3 महीने की अनकंडीशनल वारंटी। डाउनलोड करें इंडिया का नंबर 1 कार सर्विसेज ऐप गो मैकेनिक।
गो मैकेनिक।
अरे गया नहीं अभी तक? गाड़ी की सर्विस कब से ड्यू है यार? ये थोड़ी जाएंगे कहीं। ये तो गाड़ी की सर्विस करवाने के लिए कहीं जाने की जरूरत नहीं है। कोई गड़बड़ नहीं है। गो मैकेनिक पर पाए एक्सपर्ट कार सर्विसेज, 50 पॉइंट इंस्पेक्शन और 3 महीने की अनकंडीशनल वारंटी। डाउनलोड करें इंडिया का नंबर 1 कार सर्विसेज ऐप गो मैकेनिक।
गो मैकेनिक।
Joe Biden, now the 46th president of the United States, has a full plate in front of him.
Afghanistan has been the heart of American military power.
In a clear warning to China, India's military has now taken control of the country for 1 year.
What was happening inside the virology lab in Wuhan?
One ship was able to freeze global trade.
We want love, we want peace, we want equality!
There are a traditional recipe, and it's really very delicious.
It's code red for humanity. The alarm bells are deafening. Wildfires, floods, and hurricanes. Extreme climate events warn of impending doom. Is the world heading towards a climate catastrophe? Watch WION's Climate Tracker weekdays at 12 p.m. GMT, 5:30 p.m. IST.
How to fix the holes in our ozone layer. You don't know how to bring the salmon back up a dead stream. You don't know how to bring back an animal now extinct. And you can't bring back the forest that once grew where there is now a desert.
You have ignored us in the past and you will ignore us again. We have run out of excuses and we are running out of time.
Show us your faithfulness. Show us your trustworthiness. Show us your honesty. Prove us wrong. We desperately need you to prove us wrong. God help us all if you fail to prove us wrong. God, help us.
One trillion species, 7.8 billion humans, 1.9 million species extinct, one planet. Where are we heading? What should we do?
Watch Climate Tracker, only on Wheel. World is One.
World is One. My name is Priyanka Sharma. The battle for Kiev, the Ukrainian capital, has begun. Explosions and gunfire rang out overnight. Russian troops are closing in. Ukraine's President Zelensky has refused an order from the US to evacuate him. He says he needs ammunition, not a riot. The US has promised $350 million of additional military assistance to Ukraine. Will this be enough? Will the Ukrainian capital fall, as the West predicts it will? What's going on currently in Vladimir Putin's mind? What does he want? We'll try and answer all these questions on WION today. Let's first take a look at the latest updates. Kiev authorities impose a day and night curfew until Monday morning after some Russian forces entered the Ukrainian capital. Firefighters say that 6 people were injured when a missile hit a high-rise building on the southwestern outskirts of Kiev, and 80 people were evacuated from the heavily damaged building. Russian missiles rain down on Kiev, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky addresses the nation in a selfie video mode and says, contrary to reports of him trying to flee, he is staying put in the capital. And Ukraine's President Zelensky also says that he has spoken to India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi, further urging New Delhi to provide political support in this crisis. Evacuation flight from Romania's Bucharest carrying Indian nationals lands in Mumbai. More than 200 Indians, mostly students who were studying in Ukraine, were greeted by India's Cabinet Minister Piyush Goyal at the airport.
And to my Russian friends, я не верю, что эта война от вашего имени. This crisis, this tragedy can and must come to an end. Тому що світу потрібна вільна та суверенна Україна. Слава Україні!
Speaking in Ukrainian, Russian-British Prime Minister Boris Johnson expresses his support for Ukrainians and says that President Putin's actions are leading to complete isolation for Russia.
Видели?
After 3 days of living with strikes, sirens and fear, residents of Kiev brace themselves for another night of sheltering underground as Russian troops close in on the capital's outskirts. Ukraine has denied Russian claims that it is refusing to negotiate a ceasefire with Russia, but says that it is not ready to accept any kind of ultimatums or unacceptable conditions. Ukraine's wartime President Zelensky has called on his people to take up arms and defend their country. He has claimed that the country's forces had repulsed the Russian assault and vows to keep up the struggle. This as Zelensky reiterates his appeal for more help from the outside world.
Київ та ключові міста навколо столиці контролюються саме нашою армією. Окупанти хотіли заблокувати.
We have withstood and successfully repelled the attacks of the enemy. The fights continue in many cities and regions of the state, but we know what we are protecting: the country, the land, and the future of children. It is our army that controls Kyiv and key cities around the capital.
Полях тривала справжня битва за Київ.
Kiev's mayor has announced that the curfew has been tightened around the capital and all violators will be considered to be the enemy. Central Kiev appears quiet on Saturday, though sporadic gunfire could be heard. Meanwhile, Britain's defense minister says that the bulk of Russian forces were 30 kilometers from the middle of the city. Russia, meanwhile, says that its assault on Ukraine is aimed only at military targets. But bridges, schools and residential neighborhoods have been hit since the invasion began on Thursday with air and missile strikes. And Russian troops entering Ukraine from the north, east and south. Ukraine's health minister has said that 198 civilians have been killed in conflict so far, including 3 children. Meanwhile, Russian Defense Ministry says that they are not targeting Ukrainian cities. The conflict has driven thousands of Ukrainians from their homes in search of safety. In fact, UN officials say that more than 120,000 Ukrainians have already left the country for Poland, Moldova and other neighboring nations. Now, for more analysis and perspective on this broadcast, I'd like to take a moment to introduce our guests on this broadcast. Joining us now live is Ruslan Botnik, who is a political analyst from Kiev. He's joining us now from Kiev in Ukraine at this hour. Also joining us is Terry Schulz, who is a journalist from Brussels, and Vasyl Filipchuk, who is the chairman of the International Center for Policy Studies and Ukrainian diplomat from Brussels. Thank you so much to our esteemed panel for joining us at this hour. My first question I'd like to take to Ruslan. I want to start by asking you, what do you make of the recent offer from the US, $350 million in military assistance to Ukraine? Will this be enough to arm Ukraine against Russia?
Of course, it's great support from the United States, but this support is not on time. We don't have enough time to use this support to buy enough weapons or to train our soldiers. We don't have enough time to use this money effectively. So money is good, political support is good, the pressure on Russia in this situation is also instrument, but I think the Western partners of Ukraine lost a lot of time to really to really support Ukraine, and for nowadays Ukraine is alone with Russian troops in our country.
Right. Thanks for that, Ruslan. Coming to you now, Terry, let's talk about NATO. Ukraine has been asking to be made a member of the alliance for a while now. What has stopped NATO to do the same?
Well, NATO will say that there is a process for membership in the alliance, and Ukraine has been going along this path now for many years, and was promised in 2008 at NATO's Bucharest summit that eventually Ukraine and Georgia would both be members. But there are a lot of things to fulfill that Ukraine hasn't done yet. Some of these are reforms of armed forces. And then, of course, it got a lot more complicated in 2014 when Russia invaded Ukraine the first time and seized Crimea. So now you've got a country with occupied territory, and that would be very difficult to integrate into NATO, even if Ukraine were ready in all other aspects, which it actually isn't. Of course, there's been a lot more pressure on the alliance now in the last year, certainly in the last months and in the last days and hours, to bring Ukraine into the fold. That's something that is in the cards at this moment.
Right. Let's now get your perspective, Vasyl. You, of course, given your expertise, how do you see the crisis unfolding in the coming few days, and what's your assessment of the developments that are currently taking place in Ukraine at this hour?
Well, first of all, I think our army showed its strength, and I think it's a huge surprise for Russians, for Mr. Putin to see so strong resistance from everywhere. On every street, in every village, every town, everywhere in the country, no one is meeting them with flowers, everyone is meeting them with arms, with hate, with all the obstacles we can do to stop Russian invaders. I think no one ever has united Ukrainians like Putin now in resistance to Russian invasion. I've never seen all Ukrainians sharing the same goals, the same emotions. We are all shocked and we are all united to resist Russian invasion. What is important for us here at this program, I think it's very clear. First of all, it's barbaric actions from Mr. Putin, which should not be tolerated by any country. I was really surprised today to read that Putin spoke to his Indian counterparts and explained, and it was received with understanding. I don't know, maybe it's Russian fake and disinformation, but I think India and all civilized world have just stopped talking to Mr. Putin. He should not be handshakeable.
We'll, of course, discuss Putin's strategy in kind of aligning with other countries later in the broadcast. Coming back to you, Ruslan, you are in Kiev, in Ukraine at this hour. Tell us a little bit about what's happening around you. We've been hearing about martial law being imposed. We've also heard about continued shelling, an apartment building that caught fire after an attack. Tell us what's happening on ground.
I don't see the big panic, for example, or I don't see the big or heavy clashes in the Kiev now. But the city and the streets almost empty, and we have big queues to the pharmacies and some shops, grocery shops, which are still works. We see the very small amount of cars as ordinary. Most people now are in their flats or in the basement, where they're looking for the places to be defended from the ceasefire or shelling, which is sometimes happening in Kyiv. But we see some last night we see some types of violence in the streets, but no Russian war. No Russian troops in the streets for nowadays in Kyiv. People are scared, of course. People are preparing for the worst situation in this situation. But at the same time, Kyiv is still live. And road transport is works. People trying to find the best place for living in this situation.
Right, Terry, I want to get my next question. I want to take my next question with you. Will this violence spread into other NATO members such as Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and Romania? What will be the implications of what is now seeming like a full-scale invasion for Europe at large?
Yeah, that's certainly the concern, and that's what NATO's guarding against, of course, as it always says. Ukraine does not have these Article 5 guarantees, but these other countries that you mentioned, the Baltic states, Poland, Romania, they do have the guarantee of NATO's 30 countries behind it. And so that's what you've seen the alliance do, reinforce its own territory, to Ukraine's heartbreak, of course. So they've been sending thousands more troops. The United States in particular has sent many thousands, I think upwards of 12,000 extra troops just now in the recent weeks, and other countries as well. France is leading a new battalion that will go into Romania. You've seen even Germany send more troops to Lithuania, Netherlands sending equipment, France sending equipment. I mean, really, NATO allies have stepped up to reinforce their eastern flank. No one suggests that President Putin would step across that border into NATO territory, but at the same time, there were plenty of people who didn't think he'd do what we see happening today, and so no one can be sure. And even the instability is a factor in these countries, and having more troops and more equipment there is reassuring to them. The other thing that they're looking at is the number of Ukrainian refugees that are coming into Poland and into the Baltic states to some extent, and they are being welcomed. The European Union has a role to play here, and they have already put in place some of the infrastructure assistance that they have, and everyone's saying that Ukrainian refugees are welcome in neighboring states.
Right. I'm glad you pointed that out, because we've actually been airing reports on our network about there being an exodus of refugees who are now trying to flee Ukraine, and they've all amassed at Poland's border. Now, coming back to you, Vasil, let's talk about the Western reaction to all of this. UK forces have arrived in Eastern Europe to reinforce NATO's Eastern Front. That's what the Ministry of Defense says. The US currently is promising more aid. But the big question is Russia afraid of global isolation?
No, I don't think Russia is afraid of global isolation, as they have good alliance with China, and Russia and China is already quite a lot. So I think Russia is afraid the most from Ukrainian resistance, which would lead to thousands of Russian soldiers killed, and what we see already 3 days of resistance. It's already something which we achieved and which sends a strong message to Putin. He will not take it for granted. He might take over land, but not people. And price for this adventure, for this crime for Russia will be horrible. So West, of course, Western reaction is on one side good that they react, good that they send us weapons and they think about sanctions, but it's, as always, too late and too little. I think West must impose the toughest ever sanctions, just like with Northern Korea. Russia should be not handshakeable. There should be Russian embassies closed. Right. Russia should become in absolute isolation. And on the other side, what we need is support to our asylum, our war refugees, and support of Ukraine with weapons.
Absolutely. I think the talk of sanctions and the need for harsher sanctions is something that most experts and analysts are now calling out for. Coming back to you, Ruslan, now you're in Kiev, the Ukrainian capital, which is, of course, which has taken global center stage at this hour. Another figure that's taken center stage is, of course, the Ukraine President Zelensky. He has refused to leave Kiev despite an offer from the United States to evacuate him. He earlier said that he's target number one for Russia. What can you tell us about that?
I don't think he's target number one for Russia, but we should. I think he is the post of president of Ukraine is a political symbol of Ukraine for nowadays. And if president will leave Kiev, it will mean that he will be losing by the face of Russian forces. And this is political symbol, and Zelensky understands it, and I think his team, political team, will be till then in our city, in our capital, because Russia is waiting scary on the face of Zelensky. Russia is waiting the time when Zelensky escapes from the Kiev, and it will be a victory for Russia. All understand this, and we don't know where is Zelensky at real life, but we hope, and the president says for us, that he is still in capital. Russia is not going to kill Zelensky, you should understand. Russia wants to see the picture when Zelensky escapes from Kiev, and it should be a victory for Russia.
Right. Terry, I want your perspective on the same as well. Now, in moments of conflict and crisis, we see a leader emerge at that time. What is your perception of how Zelensky has handled himself as well as fought for his country in terms of handling this crisis?
I think you've heard leader after leader praise Volodymyr Zelensky for his calm, his bravery. I was at the Munich Security Conference a week ago when he gave a speech to a standing ovation and criticized the European Union. Of course, that time the invasion hadn't started yet, and said, look, you've got all these sanctions and you're telling us that we're going to be invaded, but that you can't impose your sanctions before that. If you're so sure, do it now. And, you know, of course, that didn't happen. And then we saw just a few days later the invasion start. He's also been very critical of NATO, saying you need to let us in now. So I think in many ways he's been fearless, standing up against these huge institutions that he and his people, and I would have to say many people here as well, feel should have done more. I've in fact just come back to join you from a huge demonstration in downtown Brussels, thousands of people, and not just Ukrainians, thousands of people from everywhere standing up and saying NATO should do more, cut Russia off of SWIFT, create a no-fly zone.
Right, Terry, there seems to be some audio issue in your feed. We'll try and get back to you as soon as possible. Vasil, coming back to you, let's talk about the contentious issue of sweeping sanctions that have been imposed by the West on Russia. Will they work to deter Russian aggression at this point? They have clearly failed to do so in the past.
No, I don't really think there is any sanction which could really force Putin to change his mind. They already survived sanctions of 2014. They modernize their economy. They have a serious relationship with China. So I think that sanctions will have a long-term effect on Russia, just really transforming it into Iran or Northern Korea type of country. But for the moment, no. Certainly in course of next weeks or months, Russia will behave like that. That's why I repeat that West must not only talk about the strongest sanctions, but we have to rebuild the global decision-making system for international security. Russia is in UN Security Council. How killers can be there? I think UN has to exclude Russia from its participation. Russia has to be deprived from Security Council veto, and then UN could impose real decisions which would stop Russians. With ordinary sanctions, no, they will not work. We should think innovative. We should really find a way to be on the level of cynicism and actions which Putin has. Our response should be of the same type of strong and efficient.
Right, and on that note, it's time to wrap up this discussion. I'd like to thank and express my gratitude to all our esteemed guests who joined us on this broadcast and gave all their insights. Thank you for joining us on WION World is One.
Thank you.
And now, as we wrap up this broadcast, here's a look at what the biggest leaders in the world have said. Some commentary coming in on the Ukraine conflict. Take a look.
В мережі дуже багато з'явилось фейкової інформації, що, немов я закликаю.
Much fake information has appeared on the internet, as if I had called to lay down arms and if there had been an evacuation. Here's the situation. I'm here. We won't lay down arms. We will defend our country because our arms are our truth. Our truth is that it's our land, our country, our children, and we will defend all of this. That's it. That's all I wanted to say. Glory to Ukraine.
Ось і все. Ось це є те, що хотів вам сказати. Слава Україні!
Ті страни-участниці. It is obvious that the accession of Finland and Sweden to NATO, which is primarily a military organization, would have serious military and political consequences that would require our country to take reciprocal steps. Финляндия и Швеция к НАТО, являющиеся в первую очередь.
The people of the United Kingdom stand with our Ukrainian brothers and sisters in the face of this unjustifiable assault on your homeland. We salute the fierce bravery and patriotism of your government, your military, and your people. I'm in close contact with President Zelensky. And as Prime Minister, I speak for us all in the United Kingdom when I say, once again, Slava Ukraini. This is a tragedy for Ukraine, and so too it is a tragedy for Russia.
I strongly suggest that you stop using the word president. He's a dictator, he's illegal.
गया नहीं अभी तक? गाड़ी की सर्विस कब से ड्यू है यार? ये थोड़ी जाएंगे कहीं। ये तो गाड़ी की सर्विस करवाने के लिए कहीं जाने की जरूरत नहीं है। कोई गड़बड़ नहीं है। गो मैकेनिक पर पाए एक्सपर्ट कार सर्विसेज, 50 पॉइंट इंस्पेक्शन और 3 महीने की अनकंडीशनल वारंटी। डाउनलोड करें इंडिया का नंबर 1 कार सर्विसेज ऐप गो मैकेनिक।
Go mechanic.
अरे गया नहीं अभी तक? गाड़ी की सर्विस कब से ड्यू है यार? ये थोड़ी जाएंगे कहीं। ये तो गाड़ी की सर्विस करवाने के लिए कहीं जाने की जरूरत नहीं है। कोई गड़बड़ नहीं है। गो मैकेनिक पर पाए एक्सपर्ट कार सर्विसेज, 50 पॉइंट इंस्पेक्शन और 3 महीने की अनकंडीशनल वारंटी। डाउनलोड करें इंडिया का नंबर 1 कार सर्विसेज ऐप गो मैकेनिक।
Go mechanic.
Joe Biden, now the 46th president of the United States, has a full plate in front of him.
Afghanistan has been the heart of American military power.
In a clear warning to China, India's
military has now taken control of the country for 1 year.
What was happening inside the virology lab in Wuhan?
One ship was able to freeze global trade.
We want love, we want peace, we want equality!
There are a traditional recipe, and it's really very delicious.
It's code red for humanity. The alarm bells are deafening. Wildfires, floods, and hurricanes. Extreme climate events warn of impending doom. Is the world heading towards a climate catastrophe? Watch WION's Climate Tracker, weekdays at 12 p.m. GMT, 5:30 p.m. IST.
You don't know how to fix the holes in our ozone layer. You don't know how to bring the salmon back up a dead stream. You don't know how to bring back an animal now extinct. And you can't bring back the forest that once grew where there is now a desert.
You have ignored us in the past and you will ignore us again. We have run out of excuses and we are running out of time.
Show us your faithfulness. Show us your trustworthiness. Show us your honesty. Prove us wrong. We desperately need you to prove us wrong. God help us all if you fail to prove us wrong. God help us.
One trillion species. 7.8 billion humans.
Beyond World is One. My name is Priyanka Sharma. We are starting this broadcast with some moving images from the Hungarian border with Ukraine. This will give you a sense of what's actually happening on ground and in and around Ukraine. Take a look. Now this is Anna Semyuk embracing her son. An emotional moment, to say the least, a tearful reunion. Her husband was forced to hand over their children and stay on in Ukraine. Her son and daughter were brought across the border to Hungary by another woman. There are thousands of more such stories, and Ukrainians who are now sending off their family members, including children, across the border, away from the war zone. All this as Ukrainian males aged between 18 and 60 years are now banned from leaving the country and have been urged to pick up arms and fight and defend their country. The Ukrainian capital, Kiev, a city of 3 million people, is battling Russian invasion for the third straight day. Sleepless and terrified Ukrainians witnessed a deadly overnight assault by Russian forces. Residents in an apartment block had a close shave when a rocket hit the building earlier this morning. CCTV footage from inside and outside the block showed the moment of impact. It is not clear at this moment if there are any casualties, but officials were seen rescuing injured residents.
Пожежу ліквідовано, загроза руйнування житлового будинку прибуло на місце подій і станом на зараз проводять евакуацію. Рятувальники головного управління сьогодні зранку у Києві ворог знову здійснив цинічну атаку на цивільну інфраструктуру столиці, поціливши у багатоповерхівку. Так, 26 лютого до ДСНС надійшла інформація, що по проспекту Лобановського 6.
Amid the mounting offensive, the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has vowed to stay and fight. Zelensky has rejected an evacuation offer from Washington and has insisted that he will continue to fight.
Зараз в мережі дуже багато з'явилось фейкової інформації, що, немов я закликаю.
Much fake information has appeared on the internet, as if I had called to lay down arms and if there had been an evacuation. Here's the situation. I'm here. We won't lay down arms. We will defend our country because our arms are our truth. Our truth is that it's our land, our country, our children, and we will defend all of this. That's it. That's all I wanted to say. Glory to Ukraine.
Ось і все. Ось це і є те, що я хотів вам сказати. Слава Україні!
Sounds of gunfire, shelling, air raid sirens and airstrikes echoed in the streets of Kiev. At least 198 Ukrainians, including 3 children, have been killed so far. Ukrainian troops were seen clearing the debris off the streets of Kiev after a barrage of airstrikes shook the city. Russia had earlier claimed that its military operations will not target civilian infrastructure. But the ground reality in Kiev paints a different picture altogether.
There's a bomb shelter over here. We spent the night there, and now we are trying to head back to our home. Near my daughter's house, there's an underground parking lot. They've been sitting in the underground parking with their children for 2 days. Honestly, in all these years I have lived, I never thought I would live to witness such horrors.
Earlier, the Ukrainian army also repelled a Russian attack in the main Kiev Avenue. The Victory Avenue is in the western part of the city, where authorities claim that Russia targeted an army base. Artillery rounds and intense gunfire were heard in the region. A police car was on fire on a street in Kiev as Russian troops stormed towards the Ukrainian capital, with several instances of street fighting also reported.
Two cars.
Currently, Ukrainian troops are defending their positions on all four fronts of the city, despite being heavily outnumbered. Kiev right now is divided between two sets of people. One, who have packed their bags and are fleeing towards the west in fear, most of them being children, women and the elderly. And the other side, which has now taken up arms to defend the country. Some 18,000 guns with ammunition have been distributed in the Kiev region alone. People have also been told to make Molotov cocktails, which are petrol bombs essentially. The country has banned all male citizens from 18 to 60 years from leaving the country. The Russian invasion has robbed all forms of normalcy in the capital. The once prized, vibrant European capital, Kiev, has been left in chilling silence. After weeks of warnings from Western leaders, Russian President Vladimir Putin unleashed a three-pronged invasion of Ukraine. The north, east and south came under heavy attack by ground, air and sea. The invasion has threatened to upend Europe's post-Cold War order.
Я тебе сейчас видео покажу, ты охуеть полетел. Летят. Пролетели. Вон еще летят.
Now, for more updates, joining us now live is Russian affairs expert Fred Weir from Moscow. Fred, thanks so much for joining us on Beyond. I want your take on the recent developments of the day. As usual, we are tracking daily updates in this conflict now. What do you make of Zelensky's presence in Ukraine at this time? He clearly has said that he will not leave the country, and he has even rejected a U.S. offer to evacuate him.
Yes, he's certainly showing a great deal of personal bravery. He's clearly got this leadership potential, and he is displaying it well. It's hard to know. I sit here examining the claims and counterclaims. I've covered wars before, and I know in the early days, you really can't believe anything that military bureaucrats say on either side. You certainly can't believe whatever pops up on your social media feed. You can believe the reports of journalists on the ground and videos that they've taken themselves or voices that they've recorded themselves. But beyond that, it's murky. It's what they call the fog of war. And we're into that big time here. But I think that the next few days will tell whether the Russians have miscalculated badly or whether they're going to basically fulfill their military goals, which are fairly limited. I think that they want a regime change in Kiev. All signs show that they are bypassing major cities, other major cities. They may be surrounding them, but not entering Kharkiv or Kherson. They are advancing, or they say they're advancing on the Donbass front. The two rebel republics claim to have penetrated deep into the territory that they claim in Donetsk and Luhansk regions. But again, these are Russian claims. I don't know. The Ukrainians say their front is holding firm. And so I know we want a breathless account of what's really going on right now, but that's really, really hard for anybody to produce.
Right, absolutely. I think for a while we at WION have been tracking the recent updates. Before I pose my next question to you, Fred, I'd like to get our viewers up to date with all the recent updates that have happened so far in this conflict. At the moment, what we're covering is that the battle has now begun for the control of Ukraine's capital, Kiev. That's what reports are suggesting at this point. Recently, an apartment building was hit by a missile or rocket early this morning, and now fighting has reportedly spilled onto the streets. Explosions and gunfire has been heard overnight as, according to reports, Russian troops are now closing in on the capital and are advancing towards the city. In all of this, Ukrainian President Zelensky has refused a U.S. offer to evacuate him from Kiev. He says that I don't need a ride. In fact, I need ammunition. Once again, making a call for military aid for Ukraine in its moment of crisis. Meanwhile, more than 120,000 people have fled Ukraine since Russia's assault began. Let's now tell you a little bit more about who stands with whom at this point. Russia's invasion into Ukraine has divided the world. The United States and its allies in the West have tried to project a united front against Russian aggression. But Russia, too, has mustered its allies. So let's now take a look at who backed the war and who has condemned it and who has... remain neutral during Europe's worst crisis since World War II. Let's start with the United States-sponsored draft resolution at the UNSC. The draft sought to deploy
говорит.
Ну так а что ты или это, что ты так собирал?
Я сама не могу.
One trillion species. 7.8 billion humans. 1.9 million species extinct. One planet. Where are we heading? What should we do? Watch Climate Tracker, only on Wheel. World is one.
Какая жесть. Просто жесть.
Прикидываешь дома сидеть, Богдан?
У нас дырка, просто в зале дырка.
Ой, блядь! Не надо. Вот. Откройся. Нет, окно, то.
Thanks for staying with us. You're watching Beyond World is One. My name is Priyanka Sharma, and here are the top updates in the Ukraine conflict. Kiev authorities impose a day and night curfew until Monday morning after some Russian forces entered the Ukrainian capital.
And to my Russian friends, я не верю, что эта война от вашего имени. This crisis, this tragedy can and must come to an end. Тому що світу потрібна вільна та суверенна Україна. Слава Україні! The people of the United Kingdom.
And speaking in Ukrainian and Russian, the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson expresses his support for Ukrainians and says that President Putin's actions are leading to complete isolation for Russia. Crowds of protesters took to the streets in Rome calling for peace in Ukraine, waving flags and banners, demanding Russia to stop its invasion of its neighbor. After 3 days of living with strikes, sirens and fear, residents of Kiev have braced themselves for another night of sheltering underground as Russian troops close in on the capital's outskirts. Ukraine has denied Russian claims that it is refusing to negotiate a ceasefire with Russia, but says it is also not ready to accept ultimatums or unacceptable conditions. Ukraine's wartime President Zelensky has called on his people to take up arms and defend their country. He has claimed that the country's forces have repelled the Russian assault and vows to keep up the struggle. Zelensky reiterates his appeal for more help from the outside world.
Київ та ключові міста навколо столиці контролюються саме нашою армією. Окупанти хотіли заблокувати.
We have withstood and successfully repelled the attacks of the enemy. The fights continue in many cities and regions of the state, but we know what we are protecting: the country, the land, and the future of children. It is our army that controls Kyiv and key cities around the capital.
Полях тривала справжня битва за Київ.
Kiev's mayor has announced that the curfew has now been tightened around the capital and all violators will be considered the enemy. Central Kiev appears quiet on Saturday, though sporadic gunfire could be heard. Meanwhile, Britain's defense ministry says that the bulk of Russian forces were 30 kilometers from the middle of the city. Russia says that its assault on Ukraine is aimed only at the military targets. But then again, bridges, schools and residential neighborhoods have all been hit since the invasion began on Thursday with air and missile strikes. And Russian troops entering Ukraine from the northeast and the south. Ukraine's health minister has said that 198 civilians have been killed in conflict so far, including 3 children. The Russian Defense Ministry, however, says that they are not targeting Ukrainian cities. The conflict has driven thousands of Ukrainians from their homes in search for safety. Meanwhile, UN officials say that more than 120,000 Ukrainians have left the country for Poland, Moldova and other neighboring nations. Ukraine is bearing the brunt of a Russian onslaught. Kiev is pleading for help from the West, but all that they're getting are assurances and more assurances and some sanctions. So how, after months of denying that Russia will not invade Ukraine, on Thursday, President Vladimir Putin announced a special military operation in its neighbor? A move that Moscow says was triggered after the West failed to take Russia's security demands about the NATO seriously. Ever since Putin announced his mission into Ukraine, the West has imposed a barrage of sanctions against Russia. These sanctions target President Vladimir Putin, Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, Russian oligarchs, banks and businesses. With that, a rising number of countries have now come up openly in support of banning Russia from SWIFT, that is the global banking system.
We support all the sanctions, so we will block nothing. So what the prime ministers of European Union are able to agree, we accept it and we support it. Well, we don't block it. This is not time being clever. This is time to be united. So it's a war, and what we have to do to get back to the situation which was prior to the war. So restore the peace.
Alongside many of NATO and EU member nations are sending additional military aid to Ukraine. They have supported Ukraine's fight for freedom, but have said that their troops will not be involved in Ukraine's war. In a recorded message to citizens of Russia, the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson said, and I quote, "I do not believe this war is in your name." Johnson spoke in Russian and Ukrainian during the message and expressed his support for the Ukrainian people. Listen in.
But Putin's actions are leading to complete isolation for Russia, shunned by the rest of the international community, hit by immense economic sanctions, and facing a needless and bloody war that is already costing countless lives, from innocent Ukrainians to your Russian soldiers who will never see their families again. And to my Russian friends, я не верю, что эта война от вашего имени. This crisis, this tragedy can and must come to an end. Тому що світу потрібна вільна та суверенна Україна. Слава Україні!
French President Emmanuel Macron, meanwhile, has said that the war in Ukraine will last and that his government is now preparing a resilience plan to deal with the economic consequences of this crisis.
Because I am going to give you a conviction this morning that this crisis will last, this war will last, and all the crises that will follow will have lasting consequences. We must therefore prepare for it with great determination.
The French Sea Police has detained a Russian ship in the English Channel. The ship was seized after authorities suspected that it belonged to a Russian company targeted by European Union sanctions. The U.S. announced that it is providing Ukraine with $350 million in additional military assistance to fight off Russian invasion. The Czech Republic has also said that it will donate machine guns, assault and sniper rifles, pistols and ammunition valued at $8.6 million to Ukraine. Meanwhile, Russia announced that it is closing its airspace to flights from Bulgaria, Poland, the Czech Republic. This after countries announced a similar move of banning flights by Russian carriers from their airspace. And now for more insights. We earlier spoke to Maximilian Haas, who is a fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute in London. Listen in to what he had to say.
I don't think stringent economic sanctions right now are likely to deter the Kremlin. We've seen some of the most drastic measures announced in over 80 years against the major country, but the sanctions regime now essentially is very close to the sanctions regime on Iran. Of course, with an even larger number of states supporting it, because it was the United States that unilaterally reimposed those and reneged on its agreements with Iran under 2014. But the United States had made very clear, and so had the European Union, and to a lesser extent the United Kingdom, that these kind of sanctions were what would happen if Putin invaded Ukraine. It is Putin who has chosen to cut the Russian economy and the Russian people off from the financial world and the technological around the world. And it is Vladimir Putin who will bear responsibility for that over the long term. So I don't think it will deter him. He's made this choice knowingly, but I do think it will in the long term significantly affect the relationship between the Russian people who do not want war and who I believe are against this war, and the dictator who does want it and has forced it upon them.
Russia's invasion into Ukraine has divided the world. The United States and its allies in the West have tried to project a united front against Russian aggression. But Russia has also mustered its own allies. So let's now take a look at who has supported the war and who has condemned it and who has remained neutral during Europe's worst crisis since World War II. Let's start with the US-sponsored draft resolution at the UNSC. The draft sought to deplore in the strongest terms Russia's aggression against Ukraine. The draft resolution was bound to fail. Russia, as a permanent member, vetoed the draft. China, India and the United Arab Emirates abstained from voting. while 11 nations, including the 3 permanent members like the US, the UK and France, and 8 non-permanent members, Albania, Brazil, Gabon, Ghana, Ireland, Kenya, Mexico and Norway, voted in favour. Far from being isolated from the international community, despite the sweeping sanctions, Vladimir Putin has managed to cement his ties with China. In his visit to Beijing in the first week of February, Moscow and Beijing entered into a deep strategic partnership with no limits, and where the two allies agreed that there are no forbidden areas of cooperation. Russia, through its strategic intervention in the Syrian civil war, has earned an ally in Bashar al-Assad. Since 2011, the United States pursued a policy regime change in Syria by backing the rebels fighting against the government to oust Bashar al-Assad from Damascus. But Putin, through military aid and 2011 and direct military involvement in Syria from 2015, helped Assad turn the tide of the Syrian civil war. Russia has its only Mediterranean port in Syria at Tartus. It also exercises close control over the Syrian port of Latakia. This has turned Syria into a stout Russian ally in the region. Syria is the only other country after Russia to have recognized Donetsk and Luhansk as independent republics. The Russian Deputy Prime Minister Yuri Borisov was on a whirlwind tour recently of the leftist nations in the Western Hemisphere from 16th February. He met with the leaders of Venezuela, Cuba and Nicaragua and signed a series of strategic cooperation agreements on aspects such as trade, energy and financial cooperation. Russia's decisive intervention into Kazakhstan has reiterated Russia's position of preeminence in Central Asia. In the month of January, Kazakhstan erupted in nationwide unrest sparked by a rise in fuel prices. But Russia, leading the CSTO troops, managed to crush these protests in a short and decisive operation. Most Central Asian nations have maintained friendly relations with Moscow and have not yet condemned Russia's invasion into Ukraine. So although the US has been working its diplomatic levers to isolate Russia for invading Ukraine, Vladimir Putin so far in the conflict has successfully managed to call the American bluff and has also showed up support for the Russian nation. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has sparked another migrant crisis. According to the United Nations, more than 5 million Ukrainians could flee across the border into European Union nations in one of Ukraine's greatest exodus. Tens of thousands of Ukrainians, mostly women and children, have already crossed into Poland, Romania, Hungary and Slovakia. However, men of fighting age have been told to stay behind to defend their country against a possible Russian invasion. More details coming up in our next report.
Ukrainian women and children fled their country on foot, in cars and by ferry on Friday as Russian missiles pounded the capital, Kiev. Many had to leave behind brothers, husbands and sons under new orders for men aged 18 to 60 to stay and fight.
There is a bombing everywhere and people are afraid and scared. So we want to leave Ukraine right now, but I think that there is no possibility for men to leave. So we need to decide. I have a 5-year-old kid and I have also my sister who has 2 kids. So we are really scared and don't know what will happen here.
Long lines of cars were jammed along the border to Romania, with many waiting for hours to reach the checkpoints.
It's a terrible tragedy and Putin is a crazy person. I have relatives in Russia as well and they are just thinking that it's not military action, but it's something like saving Russians from someone in Ukraine. So it's really sad how people don't know what's happening.
This ferry service usually takes about 20 cars from Ukraine to Romania per journey, but saw the number tripled as people fled. Tens of thousands of people poured into Romania, Poland, Hungary and Slovakia on Friday. Authorities in Romania and Poland have lifted pandemic quarantine rules for those arriving from outside the EU. And from Friday, Ukrainians could get COVID-19 vaccinations in Poland. The border congestion was also seen at the Polish town of Medyka. Some already in Poland waited anxiously for loved ones to arrive, like Andriy, who hoped his family would make it soon.
Travel is very hard, of course, a lot of cars, a lot of buses, traffic jam. And then a big prize to get here. And I hope 2, maybe 3 hours, and they will come here. I think I will cry.
UN aid agencies say the war could drive up to 5 million people to flee abroad, with up to 3 million heading to Poland alone.
It has been more than 72 hours since Russian forces marched into Ukraine, and according to the latest reports, they are just 30 kilometers from the heart of Ukraine, Kiev. The Ukrainian capital has been witnessing a mounting offensive, with shelling and airstrikes hitting several buildings. The Russian military says it has used long-range, high-precision weapons. Russia has also targeted Kiev with sea and air-launched cruise missiles. However, Moscow has reiterated that it is not targeting Ukrainian cities, but only military centers.
Еще раз подчеркну, что огонь ведется только по объектам военной инфраструктуры Вооруженных сил Украины, исключая нанесение ущерба жилой и социальной инфраструктуре. Силы Российской Федерации нанесли удар высокоточным оружием большой дальности с использованием крылатых ракет воздушного морского базирования по объектам военной инфраструктуры Украины. Еще раз подчеркну, что огонь ведется только по объектам военной инфраструктуры Вооруженных сил Украины, исключая нанесение ущерба жилой и социальной инфраструктуре.
While Russian military trucks and tanks are rolling over Ukrainian roads and are closing in on Kiev, Russia's communications regulator has warned local media over Ukraine's war coverage and has ordered the media to take down reports describing Moscow's military action in Ukraine as an assault, invasion or declaration of war. Earlier, Russian President Vladimir Putin called on the Ukrainian army to overthrow the country's leadership, which he termed a gang of drug addicts and neo-Nazis. He urged the Ukrainian military to overthrow power.
Once again, I appeal to the servicemen of the armed forces of Ukraine. Do not let neo-Nazis and banderovцы use your children, wives and the elderly as human shields. Take power in your own hands. It seems that it will be easier for us to agree than with this gang of drug addicts and neo-Nazis who settled in Kiev and took the entire Ukrainian people hostage.
While the West considers sanctions to be a tough measure to block Russia, experts say that the action is not enough to deter Moscow. Russia will now respond to the West's sanctions on Russian banks and individuals. Moscow says it will seize funds of foreigners and foreign companies in Russia. Russia's Security Council said that Moscow has not ruled out nationalizing the assets of companies registered in the United States and the European Union. The Russian Foreign Ministry has said that relations between Russia and the West are approaching the point of no return. Russia's Foreign Ministry spokesperson said that the sanctions against Putin and Lavrov reflect the West's absolute impotence when it comes to foreign policy. But as Russia continues its military actions in Ukraine, global affairs experts are warning against Moscow's move, saying that Putin had wrecked his legacy with such acts.
He could have had the legacy of a man who had brought up Russia from its knees and made it into a considerable power without doing what he has done now. But the reality is that Russia is now going to burn through its reserves that it's built up, partly due to the high price of oil, partly due to genuine macroeconomic prudence. And Russia doesn't have a bottomless piggy bank. And the longer this war in Ukraine continues, and it looks like it will continue this is a marathon, if you like, not a sprint, then the reality is that he will find it difficult. The body bags will come home, the money will be depleted, and he cannot sustain it for long. So it's in Russia's interest to have a short, quick war, and it's not going to get one.
Russian troops continued pressing their attack on the Ukrainian capital and other major cities, trying to advance on the Kiev capital from several directions. The Russian invasion of Ukraine began on Thursday with massive air and missile strikes and ground troops moving in from the northeast and the south. As Russia's assault on Ukraine continues, a number of the world's most iconic landmarks were lit up in blue and yellow, the colors of the Ukrainian flag, to show support for the country. We leave you with these visuals as we wrap up this broadcast. Stay tuned to Beyond World is One.
We own tracks, the biggest flash.
अरे गया नहीं अभी तक? गाड़ी की सर्विस कब से ड्यू है यार? ये थोड़ी जाएंगे कहीं, ये तो गाड़ी की सर्विस करवाने के लिए कहीं जाने की जरूरत नहीं है। कोई गड़बड़ नहीं है। गो मैकेनिक पर पाए एक्सपर्ट कार सर्विसेज, 50 पॉइंट इंस्पेक्शन और 3 महीने की अनकंडीशनल वारंटी। डाउनलोड करें इंडिया का नंबर 1 कार सर्विसेज ऐप गो मैकेनिक।
गो मैकेनिक।
अरे गया नहीं अभी तक? गाड़ी की सर्विस कब से ड्यू है यार? ये थोड़ी जाएंगे कहीं, ये तो गाड़ी की सर्विस करवाने के लिए कहीं जाने की जरूरत नहीं है। कोई गड़बड़ नहीं है। गो मैकेनिक पर पाए एक्सपर्ट कार सर्विसेज, 50 पॉइंट इंस्पेक्शन और 3 महीने की अनकंडीशनल वारंटी। डाउनलोड करें इंडिया का नंबर 1 कार सर्विसेज ऐप गो मैकेनिक।
गो मैकेनिक।
Joe Biden, now the 46th president of the United States, has a full plate in front of him.
Afghanistan has been the heart of American military power.
In a clear warning to China, India's
military has now taken control of the country for 1 year.
What was happening inside the virology lab in Wuhan?
One ship was able to freeze global trade.
We want love, we want peace, we want equality!
There are a traditional recipe, and it's really very delicious.
It's code red for humanity. The alarm bells are deafening. Wildfires, floods, and hurricanes. Extreme climate events warn of impending doom. Is the world heading towards a climate catastrophe? Watch WION's Climate Tracker weekdays at 12 p.m. GMT, 5:30 p.m. IST.
You don't know how to fix the holes in our ozone layer. You don't know how to bring the salmon back up a dead stream. You don't know how to bring back an animal now extinct. And you can't bring back the forest that once grew where there is now a desert.
You have ignored us in the past and you will ignore us again. We have run out of excuses and we are running out of time.
Show us your faithfulness. Show us your trustworthiness. Show us your honesty. Prove us wrong. We desperately need you to prove us wrong. God help us all if you fail to prove us wrong. God help us.
One trillion species, 7.8 billion humans, 1.9 million species extinct, one planet. Where are we heading? What should we do?
Watch Climate Tracker, only on Wheel. World is one.
Of if Russia takes the capital, it's a question of when.
The Russian forces very much closing in on the Ukrainian capital. The Kremlin is saying that it's open for talk.
Reassuring the NATO allies, and reassurances will not be enough for Kiev at this point. Russian missiles pounded Kiev. Families ran for cover in shelters. The hardest hitting stories from Ukraine, though, are not about military position. Thanks for staying with us. You're watching Beyond World is One. My name is Priyanka Sharma. Let's take a look at the latest updates in the Ukraine conflict. The mayor of Kiev extends a curfew in the Ukrainian capital, which is under heavy Russian attack for a third day as Moscow's forces press ahead in their invasion of Ukraine. Zelensky says Ukraine's forces have halted the Kremlin's push to capture Kiev and oust him and urge Russians to pressurize their leader Vladimir Putin to stop the invasion. French President Emmanuel Macron says he is convinced that this war will last and warned of tough consequences at home as a result of the Russian invasion. is providing Ukraine with $350 million in additional military equipment to fight off Russia's assault. Secretary of State Antony Blinken announces the same. The Polish Interior Minister says that 100,000 people have crossed the border into Poland from Ukraine since Russia's invasion this week. New Delhi speeds up the evacuation from war-torn Ukraine as the second flight from Bucharest has taken off for Delhi with 250 Indian nationals.
And I'm your ambassador in Romania. I know that you have come through a very long and arduous road journey. So the last thing in your mind is an announcement by the ambassador.
And global protests against Russia's invasion of Ukraine continue around the world. Hundreds gather in Madrid holding signs reading "Stop Putin and Peace and Freedom in Ukraine." Today is the third day after Russia launched its offensive against Ukraine. If you're joining us at this hour on WION, this is where things stand at the moment. The Kremlin has accused Ukraine of prolonging the conflict by refusing negotiations. The Russian army has been ordered to broaden Ukraine's advance from all directions. On the flip side, the British Defense Ministry says that Russian advance has temporarily slowed down. While the Kremlin website is also being targeted by cyber attacks, some Russian government websites, including the Kremlin and that of the Ministry of Defense, have been down for a third day in a row. The Ukrainian capital Kiev, a city of 3 million people, is now battling a Russian invasion for the third straight day. Kiev's mayor has imposed a blanket curfew from 5 p.m. local time and says that anyone seen on the streets will be considered a saboteur. This as sleepless and terrified Ukrainians witnessed a deadly overnight assault by Russian forces. Residents in an apartment block had a close shave when a rocket hit the building earlier this morning. CCTV footage from inside and outside the block showed the moment of impact.
В зале нам удалось спастись, мы были на кухне, повезло, прямое попадание в зал.
Зранку у Києві ворог знову здійснив цинічну атаку на цивільну інфраструктуру столиці, поціливши у багатоповерхівку. Так, 26 лютого до ДСНС надійшла інформація, що по проспекту Лобановського 6.
Amid a mounting offensive, the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has vowed to stay and fight. Zelensky has rejected an evacuation offer from Washington and has insisted that he will continue to fight.
Зараз в мережі дуже багато з'явилось фейкової інформації, що, немов я закликаю...
Much fake information has appeared on the internet, as if I had called to lay down arms and if there had been an evacuation. Here's the situation. I'm here. We won't lay down arms. We will defend our country because our arms are our truth. Our truth is that it's our land, our country, our children, and we will defend all of this. That's it. That's all I wanted to say. Glory to Ukraine.
Ось і все. Ось це і є те, що я хотів вам сказати. Слава Україні!
Sounds Sounds of gunfire, shelling, air raid sirens and airstrikes echoed on the streets of Kiev. At least 198 Ukrainians, including 3 children, have been killed so far in conflict. Ukrainian troops were seen clearing the debris off the streets after a barrage of airstrikes shook the city. Russia had earlier claimed that its military operations will not target civilian infrastructure. The ground reality in Kiev, however, paints a different picture altogether.
There's a bomb shelter over here. We spent the night there, and now we are trying to head back to our home. Near my daughter's house, there's an underground parking lot. They've been sitting in the underground parking with their children for 2 days. Honestly, in all these years I have lived, I never thought I would live to witness such horrors.
Earlier, the Ukrainian army also repelled a Russian attack in the main Kiev Avenue. The Victory Avenue is in the western part of the city, where authorities claim that Russia targeted an army base. Artillery rounds and intense gunfire was heard in the region. A police car was on fire on a street in Kiev as Russian troops stormed towards the Ukrainian capital, with several instances of street fighting reported. Currently, Ukrainian troops are defending their positions on all 4 fronts of the city, despite being heavily outnumbered. Kiev right now is divided between 2 sets of people, one who have packed up their bags and are fleeing towards the west in fear, most of them being women and children and the elderly. The other who have taken up arms to defend their country. Some 18,000 guns with ammunition have been distributed in Kiev. People have been told to make Molotov cocktails, which essentially are petrol bombs. The country has banned all male citizens from 18 to 60 years from leaving the country. The Russian invasion has robbed all forms of normalcy in the capital. The once prized, vibrant European capital has now been left in chilling silence. After weeks of warnings from Western leaders, Russian President Vladimir Putin unleashed a 3-pronged invasion of Ukraine. The northeast and south came under heavy attack by ground, air and sea. The invasion has threatened to upend Europe's post-Cold War order.
Еще летит. Прямо перед домами. Прямо перед домами. Прямо вот здесь.
Now, for more on this, we earlier spoke to Russian affairs expert Fred Weir. For more insights, listen in.
Well, it's already perfectly clear that it doesn't work to deter Russia. And in point of fact, for 8 years, Russia has been going through this experience of escalating sanctions, and a lot of sanctions have been applied, and Russia has so far managed to adjust to them. It's certainly built up huge financial resources, record high currency reserves, for example. It's instituted import substitution. Lots and lots of strategic planning has gone into preparing Russia for the sanctions that are coming on now. Some of the sanctions, the new sanctions, are serious, especially about Russian banks. Anything that will cut off Russia's connections, financial connections to the world, will hurt Russia.
New Delhi, meanwhile, is working round the clock to assure the safe return of all Indian nationals who are currently stuck in Ukraine. The first flight carrying Indians evacuated from Ukraine landed in Mumbai on Saturday evening and were welcomed by Union Minister Piyush Goyal at the Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj International Airport. The Air India plane, which had taken off from Bucharest, brought home 219 passengers, mostly students.
Please,
reassure all your are in Ukraine not to worry, be patient. Today the Honorable Prime Minister spoke to the Ukrainian President also and requested him to keep all Indians safe and secure, to provide safe passage to all your colleagues who are still there.
Upon receiving the students, Goyal said that he was glad to see the smiles on the faces of Indians who have been safely evacuated from Ukraine at the Mumbai airport. Under India's evacuation mission, Operation Ganga, another flight carrying Indian evacuees has now taken off from Bucharest. Meanwhile, most batches of Indian students have arrived in Hungary from the Zahoni crossing and will be travelling to Budapest, from where they will return on the special Air India evacuation flight. New Delhi has urged all nationals to not move to any of the border posts without prior coordination with Indian officials. The latest statement says that the situation at many checkpoints is extremely sensitive. The Indian government is working closely with Poland, Slovakia and Romania to ensure a safe return of its citizens, but according to officials, it is becoming increasingly difficult to help nationals cross over to other nations. India, but the government has decided